Good morning, everyone. My name is Simon, and I'm a design research fellow working with the EPA. Just to give you some context, just in terms of by way of a very quick introduction, I'm going to try and keep to the 20 minutes, which is not always that easy. I actually originally trained as a product designer, but what I'm actually interested in my work is actually how we use design to develop public services and other policy interventions. In that work, I'm also interested in how we apply insights from behavioral sciences so that we know we're designing services and policy interventions that bring about behavior change and that are also designed around how people actually behave in the real world. Within the work that I'm doing with the EPA, I suppose I'm working across a few different policy domains, but most of my time is spent working on issues to do with the circular economy, which we heard some discussion earlier on, and this issue to do with sustainable communities. So in terms of the context of the discussion today, I suppose why is a design researcher working with the EPA on a topic to do with sustainable communities? I suppose just from the environmental side of the house, or from the environmental policy side of the house, why we need to think about sustainable communities, and definitely within my work, thinking about the behavioural issues around how we design public services and policy interventions. I think we need to think much more about the kind of community dimension of environmental policy, because I suppose we now have a couple of decades of kind of conflicting evidence around the effectiveness of individually focused interventions in terms of trying to bring about pro-environmental behaviour change. Definitely within the kind of the research community, there's a sort of say the kind of the argument is now, well, actually the rate and scale of change that we need to see happen in terms of the transition towards sustainability, focusing on individuals may be a little bit inefficient, and we need to think much more about collective action, community behaviour change, and that kind of idea of societal transition. We also have some kind of good evidence from, I suppose, different areas of environmental policy, particularly in the area of kind of energy and energy behaviours. Some good research outside of Ireland looking at actually comparing effectiveness of different types of interventions and showing that those that actually have a community or a collective dimension can bring about larger scales of reductions in energy consumption than those that are just focused on individuals. Also, from a kind of a research point of view, one of the areas I'm kind of interested in is the idea that the community dimension can help make visible kind of social norms around pro-environmental behaviour. One of the challenges around trying to bring about pro-environmental behaviour change is a lot of the activities are hidden from public view. So the idea of working at a community level is trying to make those kind of social norms and social practices around environment more visible. And also there's an efficiency aspect of thinking about communities in terms of the network effects of how we can kind of more rapidly scale up interventions by working with communities and through social networks. And then I suppose just, which has obviously been mentioned this morning, just for me kind of thinking about the kind of the relationship between the work that we're doing and the kind of the health debate. And the obvious thing that from what I'm interested in from my own perspective is obviously the social determinants of health, and that's about lifestyle and behaviours and the context within which and how we behave. But as obviously there's a very kind of clear relationships between that and I suppose the kind of the health, environment and well-being nexus. I suppose for my own work, I'm more particularly interested in, I suppose, the inner circle, which I suppose the EPA would describe as the environmental exposure pathways. The reason why I'm interested in that in my work is because they're the things that people actually interact with regularly on a day-to-day basis in terms of in their homes and within their communities. And again, I'm just going to try and not repeat some of the stuff that's been discussed already, but just in terms of reflecting on the work that we're doing, I suppose some of the obvious interactions between environment and health. I suppose the first one we don't need to talk about, it's probably more now self-evident about the idea of having sustainable communities being kind of healthy environments within which people can live, that we have some relatively good evidence, a lot of correlational research around the relationship between access to green space, having kind of permeable urban environments for walkability and cyclability, that these actually have quite strong benefits from a health perspective. I suppose thinking of like some of the more theoretical work, what I suppose part of what I'm interested in is issues around developing sort of sustainable communities and community initiatives, and this link between participation and social connectivity and how you involve people in activities within their community and effects that has on people in terms of sense of individual or collective agency, self-efficacy, the sense that we can actually do something to determine and change the environment that we live within. And also the issue around social networks. By involving people within sustainable community initiatives, it's creating stronger ties within communities beyond friends and family. And there's a lot of interesting research around that, how that can help from a number of health perspectives. One area I'm particularly interested in is dealing with issues around loneliness and social isolation within communities. Obviously, there's another kind of quite a lot, an interesting connectivity between the two, which I've kind of mentioned already, is the idea of sustainable communities being context for behaviour change, and very much around this idea of making social norms around pro-environmental and pro-health behaviours more visible within communities. And there's lots of really interesting research from the environmental perspective to sort of say, well, actually, why do people not respond to messages or risk or perceived risk? And quite often it's that social community context. Because they don't see other people doing it, they won't act on it themselves. And then I suppose another area that I see is relatively important in this discussion is just this idea of well-being and place-based approaches. This is some work that we're doing, so starting very early stage, some work with this, with the Environmental Pillar, Social Justice Ireland, and the public participation networks. And what I'm interested in this perspective is, from my side of things, that people don't live within the silos of government, and we need to start to understand the place and context within which people live and how that affects and how people can understand well-being within those contexts. So there's a number of, I suppose, again, trying to not go down the theoretical route, but I suppose there's a number of what I would call kind of exploratory research questions that I'm interested in, that I'm trying to help inform what I decide to work on and projects I kind of take on. And I suppose some of the things, maybe this will help with some of the discussions later on. And I suppose one of the questions is, why do some places provide a better context for transition and sustainable community initiatives than other places? What's going on there? So from a research point of view, interested in the relationship between structure, the sense of agency, and why people would want to participate within their community. This starting some very early stage work with this. The second question, which is actually, is there a relationship between participation and engagement in sustainable community initiatives and pro-environmental behaviour change? So there's lots of really interesting research, academic research around the issue of social practices and understanding how the context within which people live affects their behaviour. And this idea of spillover, there's a lot of interesting research around that to say, well, if we undertake a pro-environmental behaviour in one area of our life, does it spill over into other areas? And some of the research says no, it doesn't. And then also is ultimately thinking about what's the role of state actors, the public sector, in either shaping or getting out of the way of the enabling conditions that allow sustainable community initiatives to emerge. And this, for me, is the design piece of the work in terms of how do we design appropriate interventions. So rather than sticking with I know I'm kind of talking around the issue of sustainable communities, and I suppose I'm trying to avoid giving a definition because I don't think there's a commonly agreed definition about what sustainable communities actually are. But we think about, I think maybe some of the assumptions that we have when we're talking about sustainable communities might help us start to understand it. I suppose one of the kind of a key point maybe in terms of the discussion is that the sustainable communities has been talked about a lot, but it's not something that's particularly new. I just pulled up a report from my first report when I was doing my degree looking at sustainable communities, project around sustainable communities. And so this, 20 years ago, or thereabouts. So we have, decades of practice, people trying to do it in the real world, and decades of research trying to understand sustainable communities. So while it seems kind of new, it's something that we have a lot to learn from. Importantly, from my perspective, a lot of the discussions that we have around sustainable communities are defined by physical or what we call the technical infrastructure. So if you look at a lot of the narratives definitely within Ireland, it's about if we provide people with sustainable homes and places to cycle, that is a sustainable community, but there's less of a focus on the social dimension and the social aspects of sustainable communities around kind of participation and collective action. And the whole area of social innovation. And I think we need to do a lot more work around understanding the relationships between that. If some people, which is, I suppose another assumption is that when some people go to look for examples of sustainable communities, usually what they're presented with is kind of utopic, visualizations of future communities where other people live and it's not where they live. And I think there's obviously we have a lot of good practices of developing sustainable communities in Ireland and elsewhere. So it's trying to get it into people's mind. It's about where they live, not where other people live. And again, a big part of my interest within it is how do we make all communities to become more sustainable, and dealing with the context of how cities and urban areas have already been planned, and how do we work around maybe the unsustainable constraints that we actually have to live within. And I'm particularly interested in this idea of how we allow large numbers of sustainable community initiatives to emerge to allow people to engage with sustainability where they are. I'm not thinking it has to be a new type of place to live. So within some of the research, just thinking about, when we started thinking about sustainable communities, some of the things I'm trying to understand is looking at things that are working well in other regions, the relationship between the policy context and how that actually creates conditions that actually sustainable community initiatives can emerge. You can look at it after, but this slightly strange wavy diagram, I was just basically trying to describe how the narratives around sustainable communities in Irish policy documents has changed over the last couple of decades. And I suppose I've kind of written a bit about it, but I kind of sort of see even symbolically we're moving from a sense of paternalism and top-down interventions to create sustainable communities to this idea of at least thinking about co-creation and actually working with citizens, and it's moving beyond just consultation. So at least we sort of see symbolically we're kind of thinking about the policy context that we need to create to allow kind of co-creation and to work with citizens. But again, there are a number of kind of challenges within that, and just trying to look at some of the sort of somewhat objective evidence about how well we're doing around stakeholder engagement. Obviously looking at things like the OECD Better Life Index, which is looking at a whole range of factors, thinking about national well-being in the area of kind of stakeholder engagement across all different policy domains. Actually, Ireland is kind of one of the worst performing in terms of what we're actually doing, or how we're perceived to be actually doing in terms of engaging and working with communities and other types of stakeholders. And that same message is actually repeated across a few other, this is from the Blatnovic School of Government in University of Oxford, and they've done a civil service effectiveness index and looking at different areas of performance, and looking at Ireland performs very well in certain areas, but issues around stakeholder engagement, involvement in developing primary and secondary legislation, and actual consultations, we're not performing particularly well. So I still think, even though the policy narrative is evolving, I still think there's a lot we need to understand in terms of practice. So again, the other part of what we were looking at, or what I was looking at when starting the work around sustainable communities, again, I'm interested in the relationship to things that people interact with and they understand on a daily basis, and how that affects their understanding of health and well-being. And I suppose the other part of it is that Ireland has a fairly complex network of organisations, statutory and non-statutory organisations, delivering different aspects of services to people. And these are the kind of this is not including all the NGOs and other organisations, but the kind of that complex network of organisations that are effectively trying to support communities either to become more healthy and more sustainable. And that there's a challenge within that in terms of how we maybe better understand and navigate that quite complex system of organisations. So one of the other things, obviously we spent a bit of time, I say we, but I'm using the royal we. I spent a bit of time understanding this, thinking about the context, thinking about the structures that people live within in terms of how services are currently delivered, but then also going out and speaking to, I suppose, experts and practitioners working on aspects of sustainable communities across a few different topics. And so this is a relatively small survey that we did maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago. Again, speaking to practitioners on the ground and trying to understand, well, what do they see as the policy or practical barriers to actually getting sustainable community initiatives off the ground. And I know there's going to be a discussion later on about barriers, so I won't go into detail, but there's quite a long list of perceived barriers. And then also I spent a bit of time looking at, well, actually what other kind of practical activities are happening on the ground. And this is just one example of where we started to look at a particular funding stream through the local Agenda 21 programme, which has funded thousands of very small scale, micro level community initiatives around waste and environment and community food and participation and that kind of stuff. But really we don't have much evidence about what they're doing and how they're actually working. So started to map those out and trying to understand, well, what types of activities are actually happening within communities throughout Ireland. I mean, there's a lot of stuff even just within this, looking at that. And I suppose one of the things that kind of struck me is by looking at the thousands of projects that have delivered since 2008, there's a very much strong focus on education, but it's very much less on action planning and getting things done at a community level. That's something for us to think about. Also spent a bit of time looking at across a range of different themes, so environment, the social dimension of sustainability, some aspects of health, energy, knowledge transfer and citizen engagement. I looked at a whole range of different community initiatives that were kind of exemplar case studies from within Ireland and from outside of Ireland. And part of it was really just trying to look at, well, is there some evidence about what's working and what's not working? Or can we at least understand by speaking to practitioners what's working and what's made their initiative successful, so we can start to think about what are the things we need to think about if we're going to design interventions and support services. And again, lots of really interesting insights just from the practical challenges that people face by trying to develop sustainable community initiatives. Also spent a bit of time doing field research. So this is one of the things from the design perspective we're interested in, how people actually live on a day-to-day basis and getting in-depth insights in terms of practices on the ground. So spent a bit of time where I was looking for, I suppose, kind of niche or slightly emergent sustainable community initiatives in Ireland and doing field research, which basically meant joining community events and volunteering in community gardens and really trying to understand in depth kind of the daily practical challenges that people have in terms of trying to develop sustainable community initiatives in Ireland, and some really interesting insights. And I'm even though we're faced with very multiple and complex challenges, I'm quite optimistic about the kind of the progression that if you see the kind of the optimism of activities on the ground, but also just my role in this is trying to understand actually how would we design policy interventions and support services to make this stuff easier for communities to get up and running. So again, just trying to distill some of the, and these again are to feed into some of the design principles in terms of how we might think. Some of the sort of it's probably a bit of not a trite way to say it, but some of the success factors around why some of these community initiatives have actually worked and what they felt were the things that made them kind of progress quicker. Some of the things we need to think about. So the top one would be this idea of that community initiatives having a common cause. So this is the idea that actually some community initiatives that might have been to do with social entrepreneurship or food actually originated from a response to a very local crisis that, the local shops closing down and these kind of issues. But the main principle is that to involve people within this community initiative, they all needed to understand what the challenge is and have I suppose a very direct understanding of what the challenge was and how they can then sort of say, this is something I want to actually participate in. So this idea of, how do we translate kind of challenges into things that people understand? The idea of kind of collaboration and shared commitment, this is more about how the initiatives organize themselves to be, I use the phrase skin in the game. This came out through a lot of the projects, is just actually how do we organize ourselves to ensure that there's direct involvement from people within the communities. And this idea of there's a theoretical aspect of it in terms of reciprocation, but the idea of that actually people participate, they reciprocate their involvement if they can see other people are trying to help their community. There's an issue, one of the other issues is around the idea of, this is a bit contentious, and I often say it in sustainable community groups, but this idea of the strategically focused hierarchy. So a lot of sustainable community initiatives try to organize on a very horizontal, collaborative basis, but actually with quite a lot of them, you see even within that, there is actually a hierarchy of decision making, and we need to think about that when we're designing interventions and programs, and how you work with how these different community organizations actually make decisions and get things done. Another interesting aspect was just this idea of autonomy and creativity. So how some of the initiatives, definitely during the field research, was looking at how they actually bring people into the process from a very early stage, giving them the sense of autonomy that they have a say in how things are actually done, and allowing participants within the community initiatives to feel that they can be creative about how we think about how do we make this initiative work for our local community. So it's not about having formulaic templates. It's about giving people that sense of agency that they can join and participate in initiatives. And then the other thing, which is again is quite contentious, and some people really don't like the idea, but the idea of quick wins. So if we're dealing with very large issues around climate change or other more structural challenges around decline of communities, the ones that can actually motivate people to join and participate are those that can achieve very small scale quick wins. So I often sort of say that the idea of a big vision, is good, but it's difficult to implement. And so what we need to do is give people things they can do tomorrow. And again, you see some really interesting examples of that through the initiatives that I definitely in the field research in terms of spending time with them and understanding how that works. I've got 30 seconds left, so. So when I'm kind of reflecting on that, just thinking about some of the, I suppose, I'm starting to talk about it in terms of the design principles. So the things that we need to think about when we're designing interventions and programs around sustainable communities. The big one for me is this idea of working with the grain of communities. So rather than trying to implement a organizational or policy objective onto a community, we need to get much better at using ethnographic research and the social sciences to understand how do communities actually operate and how can we design around those grains of how communities actually operate in practice. I think I hopefully kind of got this across in some of the previous slides, but we need to develop new or better platforms and ways of allowing people to collaborate. We have some new developing infrastructure around public participation and collaboration, but I think we need to do a lot more on that a lot quicker. And it's moving beyond consultation to co-creation. And that what's interesting from a design perspective is it's not just about trying to get people to engage and change what they do to involve yourself. It actually involves the public service organisations to change some of what they do in their back office operations and how they deal with the type of information that they get from communities. This idea of taking an asset-based approach, which I'm sure will come up in some of the discussion later on, but it's recognising the diversity of community assets. It's not just about trying to solve problems, but it's saying what's working within this community and how do we make it better. This issue of measuring what matters. So we're having this discussion with the work with the environmental pillar and kind of well-being at a community level, but it's how do you translate what we need to achieve at a national policy level to things that actually make sense to communities, and how do we make something around well-being and health meaningful. And we're thinking about different methods of that, whether it's storytelling or different types of approaches. And then just the last one is just about having evidence and using evidence around the social determinants of health to inform how we design services. So I know I've gone over time and I'm really sorry, but thanks very much.